This is TWiT.
DPReview science editor Rishi Sanyal got a chance to talk to the product manager of Google Camera, got a chance to play with the Pixel 3 XL cameras, both in New York, and I guess you went to San Francisco and got to play with it there. Welcome, Rishi.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's good to see you again.
It's great to have you on. I wanted to get somebody who really knows cameras to talk about this because, of course, one of the issues with camera phones is they aren't even quite point and shoot. They're killing the point and shoot market, but they're certainly not, prosumer level or better. But Google's pushing this envelope every release, and this sounds like this new one has some features that no other smartphone has done. Tell us about the new Pixel 3 XL camera.
Yeah, so I'd just like to, again, thank computational photography lead and distinguished engineer Mark Lavoie at Google, as well as the PM on the Pixel camera, Isaac Reynolds, for giving me the opportunity to meet with them and kind of step through all the technology. Just got a really nice fundamental understanding of what's going on. So there's a bunch of exciting new features. I think that we could start with just taking a look at some of the detail that's in these images from the Pixel 3 phone, simply due to what was introduced in the Pixel 2, which is the HDR plus align and merge algorithm. That's essentially, when your camera app is open, the camera's always buffering 9 frames in memory, basically the last 9 frames. And then when you hit the shutter button, the camera will go back to grab those last 9 frames, or the frame from when you press the shutter and then the last 8 frames, and align them all and then average them. And that gives it the advantage of having the noise performance of essentially a sensor almost 9 times as large because you're collecting 9 times as much light.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Apple's doing a similar thing with 5 images on its iPhone XS. And of course, Google did this last year. 9 images, but what if things move? How does it, how quickly is it gathering those images?
So in good light, it's gathering them at 60 times a second. So it's really, really fast. Okay. In very, very low light, it might drop to 30, 20, or 15, but usually never below 15 frames per second. And then what it does is it breaks the images, every single one of those frames up into thousands of square tiles, and then individually aligns the tiles. So if an object moved from one position of the frame to another, but still looks similar, like it's not like someone has turned their head and looked away while doing those 9 frames that were captured really, really quickly, then it can just move those tiles back so you can average even that moving subject. Now, if a subject moves too much, or it's like, if you look at the, I put that basketball.
Yeah, let's do the basketball image, because this is really interesting. So this is an image provided by Google that was created of 9 frames. So the problem is there's a basketball moving. It's not in all 9 frames.
Right. Well, if it is, it will have moved up.
It's going to be here and there, and yeah.
Or even, it looks like he was just doing just a throw upward.
Yeah.
But the ball's then rolling and turning. So in each of those 9 frames, it does move. And normally, if it looked the same from frame to frame, it might be able to move it back and realign it and average it. But a spinning ball is just going to look different.
It's a different thing in each frame.
Yeah. So while the rest of the image looks great, very low noise, the basketball, funny enough, has a little bit extra noise in it because probably they couldn't use as many frames to average for just that basketball.
But what's impressive is that A, they could take the basketball out of the other frames, and B, it was smart enough to say, okay, use this image for the basketball. It's going to be a little grainier, but it's going to be a complete picture. And it's doing this in less than a second. Oh,
it's doing it's the last 150 milliseconds that it gets. That's where the 9 frames come from. So it's really fast.
So you can really see, and actually there's some graininess on his arms and hands too, which were also moving. Things that move less are going to have higher quality than things that are moving. Nevertheless, you're going to get a complete picture. Yeah. Like for the backdrop, which isn't moving at all, the resolution is much better, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the important thing is you get this picture the first time. It's not like I've certainly gotten a picture like that, but it takes 100 photos and 10, 15 throws of the basketball. This is just what it does when you press the button?
Yeah, exactly. Just their tile-based aligning and merging is just so advanced. And a lot of the cool thing about Google also is a lot of those techniques are published in papers. So you can learn about them, you can develop them on your own. But even it's just like taking pictures of my toddler who's always running around, moving around. I still get fairly noise-free images even of her because within those 150 milliseconds or so, she won't have moved that much, and she probably won't look that different. So it'll just realign images of her face and body and get you an image that normally wouldn't. 2-3 years ago, we wouldn't have imagined that sort of a shot from a smartphone.
The image looks really crisp, looks really, really good. And if you don't pixel peep too much, you might think, oh yeah, this was shot with a professional camera as opposed to a
well,
camera
even if you
phone.
do, go to the shot of the Yosemite at the beginning of the album.
So this is your shot, but we're going to show a shot that's actually from Google. But we presume that Google hasn't pulled a Huawei on us and modified these.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
If you zoom in here, just the level of detail you're getting from a smartphone camera is it's incredible. And it's largely due to that align and merge of 9 frames.
So what they're doing really is not so much improving the smartphone camera to make it a better smartphone camera, but make it more like a DSLR.
Exactly. They're trying to overcome the limitations of the small sensor. And it's really smart. Now, DSLRs and larger sensor cameras would also benefit from this if they want to stay that much further ahead.
That's what I'm wondering. I mean, are we seeing this kind of computational photography in full-frame sensors?
Not yet. There are some companies and cameras that do some computational methods, like Panasonic's got 4K mode, where it's constantly taking 4K movies, essentially, and you can go back and choose the best frame. It's kind of buffering.
Right.
It has
be a lot harder to do
movies
with 942 megabyte images.
Well, yeah, exactly. And the other thing is, do you really, you can do pixel shift on the A7R3, right? And that removes the need to demosaic, gives you more detail.
Right.
But the funny thing about this is, as you get to larger and larger sensors and more professional cameras, I would love to see these techniques in it, but the need for them, it's a little
diminishes.
less if you already.
That's right.
Yeah, if you have these things really need it, and once these catch up to good enough, and in many cases they already have, then then you won't have to carry your big camera around with you. In fact, the next thing we're going to talk about is how they've now improved their buffering and their HDR plus algorithm to actually be able to hold more than 9 frames in its buffer. It can actually hold up to 15 frames now. And if you just think about, just mathematically, based on sensor size, if you're averaging 15 frames from this size sensor, all else equal, that should give you the total amount of light capture as an APS-C camera would get you. So, and since noise is mostly determined by how much light you've captured, it'll be very interesting to see if this can actually, give you images better than Micro Four Thirds or approaching APS-C. And we'll be able to test that soon in our studio.
When does the 15 image kick in? Is that a special feature?
Yes. So that's the super res zoom. So this is new in Pixel 3. The super res zoom it kicks in the camera app. If you just open it up and you hit this little zoom, can you see this?
Yeah.
Or if you start pinching and zooming.
So this has always been a limitation of smartphones. If you have a good camera, you can put a good lens. It'll zoom optically. Camera phones have always had to zoom digitally. That's basically blowing up the image, which means it's going to be pixelated. Right. This isn't doing that, though.
Well, so what this is doing is with by 1.2x zoom or more, what it does is it takes 15 frames now, and it uses your handshake as well as the optical image stabilization system in this rear camera to kind of do subtle micro shifts and move the lens around so that while you're taking those 15 shots, you've actually moved the lens around enough so that scene detail can be localized on the sensor with sub-pixel precision. So what that means is you might have scene details that fall like in between pixels or across 3 pixels or on half a pixel. But by moving the lens around and shifting the image on the sensor by tiny, tiny increments, you can basically sample the world much better. And this is a technique known as super resolution. It's been known for a long time. What the software then does is it takes those 15 frames and then again aligns it. And when you do that alignment, they actually do it at a sub-pixel level, at a much higher resolution than this simple 12 megapixels of the sensor. So when they do that alignment, they're able to extract sub-pixel detail, which means that you can get more detail, even though you're typically with digital cropping, you lose a lot of detail. but by looking for subpixel detail, you can make up for that to a certain extent. And the other really cool thing is all these cameras still have bare color filter array on them. That's not every pixel records every color. You've got these pixels that are red, then green, then blue, and you have to kind of mathematically figure out what the actual color is for every pixel. But this super resolution technique actually removes the need to demosaic because they can basically sample red, green, and blue at every single pixel location, since they've moved the lens around and sampled every scene element behind all 4 of those color filter array pixels. So they don't even need to demosaic, which itself leads to increased resolution and decreased noise.
So the iPhone solves this by having a second optical lens.
Yeah, yes.
That's going to be a better solution than any computational solution, isn't it?
Well, Google's claiming that this 2x zoom on their phone is comparable to 2x optical zoom.
Wow.
But I would think about it this way. What about all the other zooms in between, like 1.2x or 1.4x or 1.5x? You're going to have to do that on traditional devices using a digital crop. But on this, if you actually pull up my image that I shot this morning on the roof, that's a 1.2x zoom. So the first is a super resolution image, and the next is a non-super resolution version. So you can see with that smaller levels of zoom, there's a significant increase in detail as well as a decrease in noise. So if you go to the forward 2 more, you can see in some of the shadows, that's the super resolution image. And if you look at the gutter and the shadows on the siding, they're much more noisy here than in the previous shot, because super resolution by doing 15 frames gets you subtler detail, and also the extra frames lowers noise even more.
But you wouldn't necessarily notice that unless you had both of them.
You have to kind of pixel peep too. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think the point here is that every single enhancement is just making the actual image quality of the camera that much better, right? So I think you will appreciate it in certain situations. But in other situations, an optical zoom, an actual dedicated camera, would be more useful. The cool thing, though, is that as you develop each one of these technologies to get the maximum amount of quality out of a single unit, you can apply every single one of these to any additional cameras you end up adding on here later.
If I use, you can shoot RAW with this, right?
So that's the next thing we really wanted to talk about. Yes, so they've introduced RAW in here.
That means not a JPEG, but every bit of the data that's coming into the sensor in a single file. But is it a single image or is it multiple images? How are they doing that?
Here's the awesome thing. So the RAWs resulting from this phone are actually the result of those 9 or 15 frames that have been aligned and merged. So they're going to actually have the image quality of a much larger sensor. I would guess, we haven't tested it yet, but just based on the math, if you're aligning and averaging 9 frames, we actually found in our previous test with the Pixel 2 that this could compete with a 1-inch type sensor like the RX100 because of all the extra light it's gathering from those 9 frames.
Yeah, we talked about that. That's right.
Yeah, and if you do 15 now, that's going to start competing with Micro Four Thirds or larger. And the great thing is with the RAW, we can actually decouple the effects of the JPEG engine and just look at the RAW. At the RAW level, like what is the noise level? So we'll be doing that, and I think it'll be fascinating. But the other thing just to keep in mind is this is that really robust merge that Google provides, which again, if you have moving objects, they will not be ghosted. They might have a little more noise, but for the most part, since those 15 frames are captured so quickly, you should have RAW files with amazing detail. I took a look at one already, and it looked really impressive. And you've got all the highlight recoverability that you'd expect with RAW. You have none of the color channels are scaled, so you can white balance without any, in a non-destructive way, and you can recover shadows as well, which are usually plugged to black, and highlights are clipped in JPEGs. But you'll be able to actually take advantage of all that dynamic range in that what we're just calling merged or computational RAW file, and they're using DNG, so you can immediately use it in Photoshop. Yeah, it's really cool, and again, that need not to the lack of a need to demosaic your super res RAW files should lead to increased detail. So it's very exciting. It's the right way to introduce RAW in this sort of a device.
One of the things that happens a lot when you're taking a picture with a backlit, like on a bright beach with the sun behind you, is that people's faces are dark because the camera exposes for the bright background. They've got something they're doing computationally. Normally, what you'd do if you're, a professional is you'd use a fill flash. You'd have a light shining this way to counter effect the light shining this way. They're doing that computationally.
Yeah. So first of all, there's, most phones these days, including the iPhones and everyone, they still do some level of HDR, right? And the iPhone XS is now doing it really cleverly with 4 extra interframes within the 4 frames of their buffer that have much shorter exposure, so you can grab more highlight detail from those frames. So just normally HDR would sort of kind of save the background, the sun behind her, and then just raise the exposure of shadows. But what they're doing now is Google already has, as we talked about earlier, they use this what's called segmentation in portrait mode to understand what human subjects are and blur everything else. So that was trained, it was basically they used machine learning to train based off of a data set of 1 million images of human faces, subjects, bodies, to train their algorithm to understand human subjects. So now they're using that same segmentation-based approach to understand a human subject in a scene and then relight them only. Just raise the exposure and give a warm glow to human subjects. And just if done right, it gives this nice little glow to the face. If you look at the next shot of the groupie,
this one's amazing. I mean, this is very complicated because you've got backlight, you've got front light from the sparkler, and then you've got the people's faces. That'd be hard to shoot for anybody with a pro camera.
Yeah. It would involve a lot of post-processing at least, and that's kind of the smartphone philosophy and Google's philosophy here is just one button photography, so you can focus on maybe even enjoy the moment rather than
what? No.
Around with this. Isn't that fun?
That's a great shot. I mean, I'm really intrigued by all this. When I think I want to try just not using all my camera gear, but just try shooting with a Pixel 3 XL for a while, just to see what you can do with it. And after all, the best camera is the one you have in your pocket. And if it's your smartphone, wow.
Exactly. And the really cool thing here is if you don't want all those smarts of all the HDR and whatnot, you can just grab the RAW file and just do whatever you want yourself. But you're still going to get the image quality of what you'd expect from a much larger sensor camera.
Can you decide on the RAW file after you shoot it, or you have to decide before you shoot it? Say, I'm going to shoot this one RAW.
You basically in the camera app, there's a setting up here.
It says always save the RAW version.
So if you hit RAW and you do RAW plus JPEG.
Oh, so you can do RAW plus JPEG. Awesome.
Yeah, and it's all, why not just shoot RAW plus JPEG all the time? Because it's going up to Google Photos for free, at least until 2022. It doesn't impact your storage. So, yeah, you can just...
That's a good argument for the people who are saying, like, all this computational photography looks a little bit fake to me. And so you always have that RAW.
You can always fall back on it,
Can you talk a little bit about the night sight? Because that's the thing that I stopped taking pictures, like, in the dark, basically.
Camera phones, and digital cameras in general, but camera phones especially, are terrible
And
at
night. I keep getting the new iPhone and thinking, like, oh, I can do this. Even the last Pixel, which I borrowed for a month, it wasn't great. So talk about night sight.
Yeah, so what night sight is doing, so some cameras, like last year's iPhone 10 in really low light would drop to 1/4 of a second shutter speed. So that sometimes would give you better image quality in low light, but you'd also get blur from...
You can't handhold that,
You can't handle that, and if you have a moving subject or a person in the scene, forget it. They're just going to be blurred. And the iPhone's smart about this, though. If they see a moving subject, they actually up the shutter speed and sacrifice image quality. But... what Google's done last year with the Pixel 2 is because they have this philosophy of the zero shutter lag, which means that as soon as you press a shutter button, that's the image, that's your reference image, that's the image you get. So in low light, they sometimes drop to 15 frames per second, but that means that the slowest shutter speed they could use was 1/15 of a second, which still would not be enough, even if you're merging 9 frames in low light. So what they've done this year is, rather than just taking a really, really long exposure, what they're doing is taking a set of 9 to 15, still somewhat long exposures, but short enough that you probably can handhold it and a subject hopefully wouldn't move. So they will, I don't think they've actually settled on a shutter speed yet, but I heard something around 1/3 of a second or 1/4 of a second, but they take 9 to 15 of those. So that simulates an exposure that would be up to 5 seconds long. But because you've taken multiple samples, you can then align them again, use their robust align and merge technology to simulate the effects of a 5-second exposure. So if you take a look at some of the examples, this one is what it would look like without night sight. And you go to the right.
That's huge.
Yeah, you get a lot of. If you zoom in, there's going to be some loss of detail, obviously, but it's not bad at all, considering that. I mean, this was taken in complete darkness.
Wow.
And if you were to use a normal camera to do a 5-second exposure, you'd just get blurred subjects. But again, by kind of doing it in a staccato fashion, by taking multiple exposures that are like 1/4 of a second each, then hopefully you can handhold 1/4 of a second, maybe 1/5 of a second, and have subjects stay still. But then you take 15 of those, and then you get what's equivalent to a 5-second or more exposure.
That's also good for kids if they're not allowed in the park after dark. They could just take.
Mom, it was the middle of the day. Can't you tell? Hey, show the next one because that's even more dramatic.
This one.
So that's
a normal front-facing camera. That's what you would get. And
this is the selfie cam. That's what I find interesting about this.
Yeah.
Look at that.
And so two things happened here. One, they switched to the groupie cam, which is a wider field of view, so you can get yourself and your friends. But yeah, you look at the dramatic difference in exposure.
It looks like there's a film light. It looks like something's going on. That's amazing.
So one really interesting thing here also is that when there's so little light, it's actually hard to figure out what the dominant light source is to white balance properly. So they're actually using a learning-based auto white balancing pipeline to figure out what the colors should be.
Oh my
so there's a lot of, I know it's a buzz term, but there's a lot of machine learning that has gone into making these images better.
And by the way, and this is a big issue with digital photography and even film photography, which was often tested and designed using Caucasians, white faces. Often people of color just disappeared. And if you look at that image again, you've got 3 different skin tones, all 3 rendered perfectly. Perfectly. That says a lot right there. I mean, that is truly remarkable.
I think their training data set when they're teaching or iterating their algorithms had in it, tons of different skin tones.
Much better. Much better. So it sounds like Google can upgrade this stuff too over time and plans to. Is that the case?
Yeah, and some of these features might actually come down to the Pixel 2 as well. In fact, Night Sight is actually not available yet on the Pixel 3. But yeah, the funny thing is this is all updated all the time. So you can actually just get, we'll look at next with the portrait mode enhancements. You can just get enhancements just downloaded over firmware because they just iterate their algorithms over time. So it's very different from traditional cameras. So this is what I wanted to talk about next is the improvements to portrait mode. If you go back left one, you'll see that the railing is still in focus, even though it's in the background, while another part of the railing is not. But if you go to the next shot, the railing is uniformly defocused. And so this is an example of a subject that's a little further away. Traditional stereo-based algorithms, so with the Pixel 2, they use the split pixels in this dual pixel sensor to get a depth map. And it's a tiny disparity. It's a 1 millimeter disparity, but you can still see 2 different perspectives behind the lens. And from that, calculate a depth map because anything closer to you will have less disparity than something further away, depending on where your focus plane is, of course. But sometimes that can lead to errors, especially for subjects that are further away because there's so little disparity between the left and right pixels as a subject that's further and further away. So that's a good example of what they're doing now, which is they're not just using the stereo information to generate their depth map. They now use a learning-based pipeline to generate their depth map. So they've trained it to be more intelligent. So if you take a look at this, Elmo's in focus, but there's some part of that table in the background is also in focus, and that shouldn't be the case. So this is the Pixel 2 algorithm. Now here's the Pixel 3 learning-based pipeline for generating the depth map, and you can see that now everything in the background is uniformly blurred. And if you look at the heat maps, this is the previous depth map that was generated, and you can see that basically yellow is closer, blue is further away. And you can see parts of the table have this sort of green-yellow that indicate they're like almost the same, at the same plane as Elmo, which is not true. That's why it was not being blurred. But now with the learning-based pipeline, you can see the tables and everything in the background is blue. So that's definitely a part of the background. So they're doing a much better job of generating this a uniform, smooth depth map. You'll just get better uniform defocus, better transitions from in focus to out of focus, and also especially in the peripheries of the image, we used to sometimes find, or if someone is kind of like standing like this, something, the background will be defocused, but what you see through them, through their arm, won't be defocused. So those sorts of problems have now been addressed. So you should get much more uniform background blur.
It's interesting. I mean, I have a list of all the specs of the camera, but it doesn't really matter anymore what the megapixels are, what the focal lengths are, what the shutter speeds are, because there's so much computation going on that it overcomes the actual specs of the camera. So there's no point even talking about it.
Well,
and sorry, go ahead.
My question is, I mean, I understand that Apple also does machine learning, but it seems to me that Google is way ahead and has more data. I mean, do you think that Apple could ever catch up in terms, I know they could catch up with the hardware, but in terms of the computational photography part about it, do you think that the Pixel will just keep getting better and better and the gap will widen?
I wouldn't necessarily say that, Apple has lots of other areas in which they're as good, if not better at, and they're also using very, very computational approaches and machine learning to do to make their images. I mean, one thing about Apple images, I think that is kind of a commonly accepted, is that their white balancing algorithm is really, really good, and their colors are great, and that's been done via a lot of computational approaches and learning-based approaches. So I think that each one has their strengths. Apple has taken a stride with the 10S in terms of the range of tones it can record. It now uses HDR and those extra inner frames, even in panorama mode, as well as in video. So you get HDR video at 30 frames per second. So they're doing a ton of things right. They're also leading the way in terms of HDR, since we talked about earlier, HDR display of HDR photos. It's like the Dolby Vision and HDR in movies. They're actually applying that to stills, which means that typically HDR images tend to look flat because you're just tone mapping this much range into this little space. Well, HDR display means you can re-expand that again, so HDR images don't have to look as flat. They actually look more like the real world and still have that contrast without sacrificing highlights and shadows. That and wide color gamut photography, Apple's doing a lot of good things there in capturing and encoding more colors. So I think it's interesting we could go on about this forever, but they're doing different things, right? In a lot of ways, they are using similar approaches. That's why a lot of times some people might not even see the difference between the portrait mode between the Apple and the Google, even though they're taking fairly different approaches. So I think that's a more complex discussion to be had, and one that's a little more nuanced, because they're both doing really good things, and I think we'll continue to see really awesome things coming from both companies as well as other companies.
Well, they all benefit. That's the beauty of the competition. Rishi, I want to thank you so much for your time. Rishi Sanyal is the DPReview science editor, and I know that you are working right now to get an article up on this, and that more will come and lots of information. I want to see all the tests. I want to see head-to-head, and I know DPReview will do that all. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, we're working on it. Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Always good to be on here.
My pleasure, Rishi Sanyal. And go to dpreview.com. And I'm sure over time we're going to see, this is something that's so interesting to everybody in photography, and I'm sure we'll see a lot more of head-to-head comparisons, things like that.
And the interview that he did with those Google engineers is up there too. I watched it. So if you want to hear even more about what the behind the scenes are doing.
Very nice.